Yejin opened her eyes to unfamiliar surroundings and the gentle hum of medical equipment. She was warm, which surprised her because her last clear memory was of freezing to death in a cave while trying to keep a small Varadi child alive. "You are awake," said a familiar voice. And Yejin turned her head to find Morena sitting beside her bed. The youngling looked healthy. Her scales returned to their proper dark shade, and her yellow eyes held an expression that Yejin had never seen on any Varadi face before. It looked almost like gratitude. "You saved me," Yejin said, her voice rough from disuse. "I remember the cave." "And then nothing. You saved me first," Morena replied simply. "I merely returned the action." Yejin smiled weakly and tried to sit up, but her body was still too weak, and she fell back against the bed. "How long have I been unconscious?" 3 days, Morena answered. "The medics were not certain you would survive because they have little experience treating humans. But you are stronger than you appear." There was respect in her voice, a quality Yejin had not expected to hear from any Varadi. "Your mother," Yejin said, suddenly remembering the threat that hung over her. "She was going to execute me. The execution has been postponed," Morena said. "There have been developments that required my mother's attention." Before she could explain further, the door opened and the Sara Cole entered the room. The matriarch looked different than she had during their first meeting. Though Yejin could not immediately identify what had changed, there was something in her posture, some subtle shift in the way she carried herself, that suggested uncertainty where before there had been only absolute confidence. "Leave us," the Zara told her daughter. Morena hesitated for just a moment, glancing at Yejin with concern. Before standing and walking toward the door, she paused at the threshold and looked back at her mother. "She is not an enemy," Morena said quietly. "Whatever you decide, please remember that." Then she was gone, and Yejin was alone with the most dangerous being she had ever encountered. Basara stood motionless for a long moment, studying the human with an expression that was impossible to read. "My advisors tell me I should kill you," the matriarch finally said. "They argue that your actions have caused instability in our society and that your death would serve as a reminder of Varadi ways." Yejin met her gaze without flinching, though her heart was pounding. "And what do you believe?" The question seemed to surprise the Sara, as if she was not accustomed to being asked about her beliefs rather than her commands. She moved to the window and stared out at the frozen landscape beyond, her back to Yejin. "I have ruled my people for 40 years, she said slowly. "I have killed more enemies than I can count, and I have never questioned the principles upon which our civilization was built." She turned back to face the human. "The weak are cold, so the strong may thrive. Compassion is corruption, mercy is disease. These are the truths I was taught and the truths I have enforced without hesitation." Her forearms crossed over her chest in a gesture that might have been defensive, and yet the word hung in the air between them. "I have been thinking about what you did," the Sara continued. "About the choice you made when you found my daughter in the storm." She moved closer to the bed, and Yejin could see something in the matriarch's yellow eyes that looked almost like pain. "You knew that saving her would likely kill you." "Yes," Yejin nodded. "And you knew that interfering with our customs would guarantee your execution, even if you survived." Another nod. "So by any logical calculation, the choice to help Morena was the worst possible decision you could have made for your own survival and for your mission." "Yes," Yejin admitted. "Then why?" the Sara demanded. And there was genuine need in her voice, a hunger to understand. "Why would you sacrifice everything for a child you did not know, of a species that had threatened to kill you?" Yejin took a breath and gave the only answer she had, "Because I could not do it." The Zara's eyes narrowed in confusion. "Explain." "Humans are built to protect children," Yejin said. "All children, not just our own. And when we see a helpless young one in danger, Something inside us overrides every other consideration. She pushed herself up to a sitting position despite her weakness. Needing to meet the Sara's eyes directly. It is not calculated or strategic. It is not about logic or survival. It is simply who we are. She thought about how to make a variety understand something that was so fundamental to humanity that most humans never even thought about it. When I found Marina, I knew I would probably die, and I chose to try anyway because the alternative was impossible. Because walking away from a dying child is something I am not capable of doing. The Sara was silent for a long time when she finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. When I left Marina in the storm last year, I felt something. She looked away, unable to meet Yejin's eyes, an uncomfortable twisting sensation that I suppressed because it had no place in Varadi life. And when I left her again this year, I felt it stronger than before. Her claws clenched and unclenched with obvious agitation. Watching my daughter fight to save you. Dragging your body through the ice while screaming for help. I felt it again, and this time I could not suppress it. She turned back to face Yejin. I think perhaps that sensation is what you call compassion. And I think perhaps I've been fighting against it my entire life. Yejin felt tears forming in her eyes despite herself. It is not weakness, she said softly. It is strength of a different kind, the strength to protect rather than destroy, to build rather than tear down. The Sara nodded slowly, as if accepting something she had been resisting for decades. The trade agreement will be signed, she said, and I will begin making changes to certain customs that have perhaps outlived their usefulness. She moved toward the door, but paused before leaving. Marina will be restored to her position as my heir, and she will be trained to lead our people in ways that I was never taught. Her yellow eyes met Yejin's one final time. You showed her something that I could not, that I did not even know existed, and for that I am. She struggled with the word, clearly unfamiliar with its taste in her mouth. Grateful then she was gone. And Yejin lay back against the bed with a smile on her face. She had come to Vorn Prime expecting to die. And instead, she had helped change the course of an entire civilization, not through military strength or clever negotiation, but through a simple act of compassion that she could not have prevented even if she had wanted to. When she finally returned home, her superiors called her a hero and wanted to know the secret of her success. She told them the truth. She had just done what any human would have done, and that, she had learned, was exactly what made humanity so extraordinary. The guards found them at the edge of the settlement. Marina had collapsed in the snow, her small body finally giving out after dragging the unconscious human for nearly 2 kilometers through the dying storm. And she was still holding on to Yejin when the patrol discovered them. Word spread through the settlement like fire through dry grass. The matriarch's disgraced daughter had been found alive, dragging a half-dead alien through the ice while crying out for help in a voice raw from screaming. It was unprecedented. It was shameful beyond measure. It was the most fascinating thing most of the witnesses had ever seen. The Sara Cole arrived at the medical facility in a rage that made the air itself feel colder, and her 4 arms were clenched into fists as she stalked through the corridors toward the room where her daughter and the human were being treated. Guards scrambled out of her way, and medics pressed themselves against walls to avoid being caught in her path. She burst into the treatment room and found Marina sitting beside the bed where Yejin lay unconscious, connected to warming devices that were slowly bringing her core temperature back to survivable levels. Leave us, the Sara commanded the medical staff, and they fled without hesitation. Mother and daughter faced each other across the small room, and the silence between them was heavy with things that had never been said. You have shamed our bloodline beyond repair. The Sara finally spoke, and her voice was low and dangerous. Not only did you survive when you should have died, But you did so by begging for help like the weakest of creatures. Marina did not look away from her mother's terrible gaze. I did not beg for myself, she said quietly. I called for help to save her. She gestured toward the unconscious human. And what is this creature to you? The Zara demanded. That you would humiliate yourself and our family name for its survival. She saved me, Marina answered. When she found me in the storm, she removed her own thermal protection and gave it to me, knowing that doing so would likely kill her. The Zara's yellow eyes narrowed. Then she was a fool. No, Marina said. And there was something new in her voice. Something that sounded almost like defiance. She was strong in a way I've never seen before. She stood up and faced her mother directly. This tiny Virati who had never dared to challenge anyone in her short life. She walked through the killing storm without protection for a stranger of another species, expecting to die, asking nothing in return. And she did this because she could not walk past a child in need. Marina's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. That is not weakness. Mother, that is strength beyond anything our people have ever demonstrated. The Zara moved with the speed that had made her legendary, crossing the room in 2 strides and grabbing Marina by the throat with one massive clawed hand. You dare speak to me of strength, she hissed. You who have been nothing but a disappointment since the moment you hatched. But Marina did not flinch and did not look away. Kill me if you must, she said. But you cannot make me unsee what I have seen or unknow what I now know. For a long moment, the Zara held her daughter's throat, claws pressing against scales but not yet breaking skin. And something flickered in the matriarch's eyes that might have been confusion before she could decide what to do. There was a commotion outside the room, voices raised in argument. Unusual in a society where hierarchies were absolute and disagreement was usually settled by blood. The door opened and a senior military commander entered, bowing low but speaking urgently. Matriarch, there is a situation that requires your attention. I am occupied. The Zara growled without releasing Marina. Forgive me, but this cannot wait, the commander insisted. The people are talking. The Zara released her daughter and turned to face her subordinate with an expression that promised violence. Explain. Word of what happened has spread throughout the settlement, the commander said carefully. Many witnessed the human carrying your daughter through the storm, and many more saw your daughter dragging the human back while calling for aid. He paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to say next. There are those who are questioning certain assumptions about strength and weakness. The Zara's eyes widened in genuine surprise, questioning. The human demonstrated something that our people cannot easily dismiss, the commander continued. She chose death rather than abandon a child she did not know, of a species that had threatened to kill her. And she did so without hesitation or apparent regret. He met the matriarch's gaze with visible effort. Some are asking if perhaps we have defined strength too narrowly. The Zara stood motionless for several heartbeats, processing this information in her entire reign. No one had ever questioned the fundamental principles of Virati society, because to do so was to invite death. Yet here were her own people, the warriors and commanders and citizens she had ruled for 40 years, suddenly uncertain about beliefs they had held for generations, and all because of one small human who could not walk past a dying child. The execution must be delayed, the commander said carefully, until we can determine how to handle this situation without causing further instability. The Zara looked at her daughter, who had returned to sit beside the human's bed. Then she looked at the human herself, this tiny soft creature who had somehow managed to shake the foundations of an entire civilization without even being conscious. Very well, she said finally. The execution is postponed until I have considered the matter further. She turned and left the room without another word. But those who knew her well might have noticed something strange in her movements. something that looked almost like uncertainty. Marina sat alone with Yajin as the human continued to fight for her life. And she held the small warm hand in her own clawed fingers and wondered how such a fragile creature could possibly contain so much strength. Outside, the storm finally passed, but a different kind of storm was just beginning. The thermal vent cave was barely large enough for both of them. A crack in the rock where heated air from deep underground seeped up to create a pocket of relative warmth in the killing cold. Yajin pressed herself against the back wall where the warmth was strongest and held the Varati child against her body, wrapping them both in the thermal garment she had given up to save the youngling. Her own teeth chattered violently, and her fingers had gone numb. But she forced herself to keep moving and keep rubbing the child's limbs to maintain circulation. The youngling's scales were still that terrible pale blue color, and her eyes kept closing as the cold tried to drag her down into a sleep from which she would never wake. "Stay with me," Yajin said through chattering teeth. "Keep your eyes open and talk to me." The child's eyes flickered open, and she stared at the human with confusion that went deeper than her weakened state. "Why?" she whispered, and her voice was barely audible over the howling wind outside. "Why what? Why are you doing this?" It was such a simple question, but Yajin could hear the genuine bewilderment behind it. This child had been taught since birth that mercy was weakness and compassion was corruption. And here was a stranger of another species sacrificing her own survival for no logical reason. "Because you needed help," Yajin answered simply. "And I was there." The child shook her head slowly, as if the answer made no sense. "I am Marina," she said, and her voice grew slightly stronger as the warmth began to seep into her cold blood. "Daughter of the Sara Cole." Yajin felt her heart skip at that revelation. The matriarch's daughter, the child that the Sara had left to die in last year's storm, must have survived somehow, only to be cast out again when she failed to grow strong enough to meet Varati standards. "Your mother left you out there," Yajin said. "Not quite a question. I was born small," Marina replied. And there was no self-pity in her voice, because self-pity would have been trained out of her from infancy. "I have always been small, and no matter how hard I trained, I could not match my siblings in strength or speed." She looked up at Yijin with those yellow eyes that were so like her mother's, yet held none of the Zara's cruelty. "My mother did what was right according to our laws, and I do not blame her for it." Yijin felt a surge of anger at a culture that could make a child believe she deserved to be abandoned. But she pushed it down because anger would not keep them warm. Instead, she held Marina closer and continued rubbing her arms and legs to keep the blood flowing. "Let me tell you about my world," she said, partly to keep them both awake, and partly because she needed Marina to understand that other ways existed on Earth. "Where humans come from, we have a different belief." Marina listened. "Too weak to do much else. We believe that every child deserves protection," Yijin continued. "Not because they have earned it or because they are strong, but simply because they are children." She paused to blow warm breath on her own frozen fingers before continuing. "Human parents would walk through fire for their children, would fight monsters, would die without hesitation to protect their young. And this is not seen as weakness among us." Marina made a sound that might have been disbelief. "How has your species survived with such thinking?" she asked. "Surely the weak must be culled or they will drag down the strong." "We found another way," Yijin said. "We protect the weak and help them become strong. We share knowledge and resources so that everyone can contribute. And we discovered that a society where people help each other is stronger than one where everyone fights alone." She smiled despite the cold that was slowly claiming her. "Humans have spread across the galaxy, not because we are the strongest or the fastest or the smartest, but because we work together and we never abandon our own." Marina was quiet for a long moment, processing these alien concepts. That sounds like a fairy tale, she finally said. A story for hatchlings who have not yet learned the truth of the universe. Perhaps, Yejin admitted. But it is also how we live. The night stretched on endlessly. Yejin's condition grew worse with each passing hour as her body lost the battle against the cold. And she knew that without proper medical attention, she would not survive much longer. But Marina was recovering. The youngling's scales slowly shifted from that deadly pale blue back toward their natural darker shade, and her movements became less sluggish as her cold blood warmed by the time the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the storm outside. Marina was strong enough to move on her own, but Yejin was not. The human lay against the cave wall, her breath shallow and her skin an unhealthy gray color. And when Marina tried to wake her, she barely responded. Human, Marina said, shaking Yejin's shoulder. You must wake up. Yejin's eyes opened, but they were unfocused, and she did not seem to recognize where she was. The cold had claimed her too deeply. Marina stood at the cave entrance and looked out at the storm that had weakened but not yet passed. And she understood with terrible clarity what she should do. The logical Varadi action was clear. The human was dying and could not be saved. And Marina had survived the night and proven her strength as her mother's customs demanded. She should leave now while she had the energy to reach the settlement. And the human would die here as nature intended. It was the proper way. It was the Varadi way. Marina looked back at the small creature who had stripped away her own protection to save a stranger, who had spent the night fighting to keep a child of another species alive, who had chosen certain death rather than walk past someone in need. No Varadi would do this. No Varadi could do this. And yet this human had done it without hesitation. Marina made her choice. She grabbed Yejin under the arms and began to drag her toward the cave entrance, pulling with all the strength her small body possessed. The human was heavier than she looked, and the journey would be difficult, and Marina knew she might not have enough energy to make it, but she could not leave her, not after everything the human had done. Not when leaving would prove that mercy truly was weakness, and that Marina was no different from the mother who had abandoned her. She dragged the unconscious human out into the weakening storm and began the long, terrible journey back toward the settlement, screaming for help in a voice that had never asked for anything from anyone. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, and it was the first truly free choice she had ever made. Yejin spent the first day studying everything she could find about Varadi culture, searching desperately for any leverage point that might help her succeed where all others had failed. Her quarters were sparse by human standards. A small room carved from the same black stone as the rest of the fortress, with minimal furnishings and a heating system that struggled against the growing cold. Outside, she worked at a low table covered in data tablets, each one containing different aspects of Varadi history and society. And the more she read, the more she understood how impossible her task truly was. The Varadi operated on strict hierarchies of proven strength, and every position of power had to be earned through combat or survival. The Zara Cole had become matriarch, not through inheritance, but through blood. And she had survived 7 assassination attempts in her rise to power, while killing each challenger personally with her bare claws. The Varadi respected only demonstrated power. Negotiations meant nothing to them because words were just air, and only actions could prove the worth of any individual or species. Yejin rubbed her tired eyes and wondered how she could possibly demonstrate strength to beings who could tear her apart without effort. On the second day, the weather reports began to show something alarming. A massive ice storm was forming in the northern reaches of the planet, far larger and more intense than anything recorded in recent decades, and it was moving toward the settlement with unexpected speed. The Varati seemed almost excited by this news, and Yejin overheard her guards discussing how many of the weak would be culled by such a powerful storm. She found their enthusiasm horrifying, but said nothing that night. The storm arrived earlier than predicted. Yejin was working on a trade proposal when the lights in her quarters flickered and then died, and she felt the temperature begin to drop immediately as the heating system failed. She waited for someone to come, expecting that the Varati would restore power to the diplomatic quarters. But minutes passed and then an hour, and still no one arrived. The cold crept into the room like a living thing, seeping through the walls and floor until her breath formed clouds in front of her face. Her thermal suit was designed for brief exposure to Vorm Prime's climate, not for extended periods without supplemental heating. And she knew she could not survive the night in these conditions. She had to find shelter elsewhere. Yejin gathered her emergency supplies and stepped out into the corridor, where the darkness was complete and the cold was even more intense than in her room. She activated the small light on her wrist and began making her way through the fortress, searching for anywhere that might have retained heat. The corridors were empty. Every Varati had retreated to their own quarters, sealed against the storm, and none of them had thought to check on the soft human who might freeze to death in the diplomatic wing. Yejin found a door that led outside and pushed through it into the howling white nightmare beyond. The storm hit her like a physical blow, wind and ice crystals tearing at her suit and reducing visibility to almost nothing. She should have stayed inside, should have found a corner to huddle in and hope for the best. But some instinct drove her forward into the killing cold. Perhaps it was the human need to act, rather than wait passively for death. Perhaps it was simply desperation. She stumbled through the storm for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Her suit's heating elements straining against the impossible cold and slowly losing the battle. And then she saw it, a small shape huddled against a collapsed structure, barely visible through the swirling ice. At first she thought it was debris or perhaps a piece of equipment torn loose by the wind. But as she drew closer, she realized it was something far more shocking. A Varati child. The youngling was barely half Yejin's height, tiny by the standards of her species, and her scales had turned a pale blue color that even a human could recognize as dangerous hypothermia. She was curled into a tight ball, barely moving, and Yejin understood immediately what she was seeing. This was one of the abandoned ones, a child deemed too weak to deserve survival, left to face nature's judgment alone. During the crystalline season, Yejin knelt beside the small body and felt for signs of life. And when the child's eyes flickered open for just a moment, she saw terror and resignation in equal measure. The youngling expected to die. She had been taught her whole short life that this was her fate, that she deserved this end because she had been born smaller than her siblings. Every diplomatic instinct Yejin possessed screamed at her to walk away. Interfering with Varati customs would guarantee her execution and doom any future relations between their species. Logical choice was clear and obvious and undeniable. This was not her child, not her species, not her responsibility. If she tried to help, she would certainly die and probably fail to save the youngling anyway. The smart move was to find shelter for herself and let nature take its course. Yejin stood there in the howling wind for 3 heartbeats, feeling the cold bite deeper into her flesh with each passing second. Then she began removing her outer thermal layer. The cold hit her like a knife as she stripped away her primary protection, and she gasped at the pain of it even as she wrapped the thermal garment around the shivering child. "Come on," she said, lifting the youngling into her arms with effort that strained her human muscles. "We are going to find somewhere warm." The child was too weak to respond, but her eyes stayed open. watching the strange soft creature who was doing something that made no sense. No variety would do this. No variety could do this. Yejin staggered through the storm with the child pressed against her chest, her own body temperature dropping with every step as the inadequate inner layer of her suit failed to protect her. She was trading her survival for the child's life, and she knew it with absolute certainty. She might have minutes left before the cold claimed her. She might have less, but she kept walking, kept searching, kept fighting against the wind and ice, because somewhere deep in her human heart she knew she could not have made any other choice. When she finally spotted the faint warmth signature of a thermal vent cave through her suit's failing sensors, she was already stumbling and her vision was beginning to blur. She pushed forward with the last of her strength and fell through the cave entrance with the child still clutched in her arms. The relative warmth of the cave felt like heaven, even though it was still cold enough to kill an unprotected human within hours. But it was shelter. It was hope. Yejin pulled the child deeper into the cave and began the desperate work of keeping them both alive until morning. She did not know the youngling's name or her story or how she had come to be abandoned in the storm. She only knew that she could not let her die. Not tonight. Not if there was any way to prevent it. Commander Yejin So stood before the massive viewport of her transport ship and watched the pale blue world grow larger with each passing minute. And she wondered if this mission would be her last. The planet below was called Vorn Prime, home to the Variety species, and it was perhaps the most dangerous diplomatic posting in all of known space. Yet the Galactic Union had chosen her for this assignment because every other ambassador they had sent to this world had returned in a body bag. Yejin was a small woman with dark hair cut short for practicality and eyes that held a quiet determination. And she had built her career on doing the impossible, on finding common ground with species that others had written off as too hostile or too alien to negotiate with. But the Variety were different from anything she had faced before. Her briefing files contained reports that would give anyone nightmares, and she had read them all 3 times during the journey here, trying to understand the beings she was about to meet. The Variety were reptilian in appearance, standing nearly 7 feet tall with scales that ranged from deep green to almost black. And they possessed 4 arms that ended in clawed hands capable of tearing through metal. But their physical danger was nothing compared to their philosophy. They believed that mercy was a disease. In Variety culture, compassion was seen as a genetic defect that weakened the bloodlines and endangered the survival of the species. And they had built their entire civilization around the principle that only the strong deserved to exist. The weak were culled. The wounded were abandoned, and enemies were shown no quarter under any circumstances. This philosophy had made them the most feared warriors in the quadrant, and their military had never lost a major engagement in over 2,000 years of recorded history. The Galactic Union needed access to rare minerals found only in Variety territory. Minerals essential for powering the next generation of starship engines, and without those resources, the Union's expansion would grind to a halt within a decade. So they had sent Yejin. Her superiors had been honest with her in a way that was almost refreshing, and they had told her directly that they considered her expendable, but hoped her reputation for creative diplomacy might succeed. Where military protocol had failed, she appreciated the honesty, even if it did nothing to improve her odds of survival. The transport touched down on a landing platform covered in a thin layer of frost, and Yejin stepped out into air so cold it burned her lungs even through her thermal suit. This was the beginning of what the Variety called the crystalline season, a period when temperatures on Vorn Prime dropped to levels that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. And she had been warned that ice storms during this time could kill within seconds. The Varadi saw this season as nature's judgment, a time when the weak were culled and the strong proved their worth. And they actually celebrated the deaths that occurred during these months as a cleansing of inferior genetics. A Varadi escort waited for her at the edge of the platform. 4 massive warriors in ceremonial armor that did nothing to hide the weapons integrated into their gear. And they said nothing as they led her through corridors of black stone toward the throne room of the matriarch, the Zara Kol, even among the Varadi. That name inspired fear. She had ruled her people for 40 years. And in that time, she had personally executed more enemies than most species had soldiers. And the stories about her were the kind that mothers used to frighten children into obedience. Yejin had seen images of the matriarch in her briefing files, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of standing before the Zara Kol in person. The throne room was a vast chamber lit by bioluminescent panels that cast everything in shades of blue and green. And at the far end sat the matriarch on a throne carved from the bones of her defeated enemies. The Zara was enormous even by Varadi standards. Nearly 8 feet tall with scales so dark they seemed to absorb the light around her. And her forearms rested on the armrests of her throne with the casual ease of someone who had nothing to fear from anyone. Her eyes were yellow and cold. And when they fixed on Yejin, the human felt like a mouse being evaluated by a serpent. "So this is what the Union sends me now," the Zara said. And her voice was deep and resonant with an undertone of contempt that she made no effort to hide. A creature so small I could crush her with one hand. Yejin stood her ground and met the matriarch's gaze without flinching, knowing that any sign of weakness would be fatal. "I am Commander Yejin So of the Galactic Union Diplomatic Corps," she said, keeping her voice steady. "And I have come to discuss terms of trade that would benefit both our peoples." The Zara made a sound that might have been laughter, a harsh clicking noise that echoed through the chamber. "Your predecessors said similar words before they died," the matriarch replied. "What makes you think you will fare any better?" "I make no assumptions about my survival," Yejin answered honestly. "But I believe there is common ground to be found if we are willing to look for it." The matriarch leaned forward, and her yellow eyes narrowed with something that might have been curiosity or might have been the anticipation of a predator about to strike. "Your species confuses me," the Zara said. "You are soft and weak, and yet you spread across the galaxy like a plague. And we cannot understand how creatures who show mercy to their enemies have managed to survive at all." She stood from her throne and descended the steps toward Yejin, each footfall heavy enough to shake the floor. "Do you know what I did last year during the crystalline season?" the matriarch asked. Stopping just feet away from the human, Yejin shook her head. "I had a clutch of 6 hatchlings," the Zara continued. "And one of them was born smaller than the others, weaker. And so I did what any proper Varadi mother would do." She paused, and her eyes locked onto Yejin with cold intensity. "I left her in the storm to die." Yejin felt her stomach turn, but forced herself to show no reaction, knowing that disgust would be seen as weakness and weakness would mean death. "This is our way," the Zara finished. "The weak do not deserve protection, and mercy is the greatest cruelty because it allows inferior genetics to pollute future generations." She returned to her throne and settled back with a dismissive wave of one clawed hand. "You have 3 planetary rotations to present something worthy of Varadi attention," she declared. "If you fail, I will have you executed for wasting our time. And your body will be left in the ice as a message to your union." The guards stepped forward to escort Yejin out, and she walked with her head held high even as her heart pounded against her ribs. 3 days. She had 3 days to find a way to reach a species that saw compassion as corruption and kindness as a genetic flaw as she was led to her assigned quarters in the diplomatic wing. Yejin looked out through a narrow window at the darkening sky. where the first clouds of an approaching ice storm were beginning to gather on the horizon. She did not know it yet, but that storm would change everything. It would challenge everything she believed about diplomacy and force her to make a choice that would either kill her or transform the future of two species. But for now, she simply stared at the gathering clouds and began to plan the fate of the mission, and perhaps her own life depended on what she did in the next 3 days.